Having made about 20 episodes in my Why No One Plays series for Smash, I found myself enjoying the characters with initially commendable ratings and representation that deteriorated throughout time. In that regard, I've made a video covering Ike, Pokemon Trainer, Joker, Inkling, and Pikachu, although I know in retrospect the Joker video was a bit misplaced. A lot of people still play him, but you get the idea. It's been a while since I've covered an next top tier. One that caught my editor's attention and subsequently mine was Suit Samus, a fighter with an extensively documented track record dating all the way back to her debut installment Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Recently, it's become rare to find a high-caliber ZSS main outside of Japan. I'm excited for this episode because it's a textbook example of the inverse of a character who was just barely viable but ended up tipping in the wrong direction compared to other Why No One Plays characters who could have seen a lot more tournament results if only they had one small buff or nerf. So for today, we'll be investigating what happened to ZSS, why no one plays her anymore. Zero Suit's playstyle contradicts her armored variant, featuring high mobility and evasive rushdown versus her counterpart's penchant for long-range projectiles and zoning. Historically, this caused the former to be seen as more tournament viable, owing to the competitive scene holding mobility and frame data in high regard, along with other properties. In Smash 4, ZSS was considered by many as one of the best characters in the game, at least prior to the advent of Cloud and Bayonetta. And even afterwards, she was a perennial top 10 character. As she and everyone else transitioned into Ultimate, she received a combination of buffs and nerfs aimed at forcing players to weaponize a more sophisticated and flexible game plan in terms of neutral, advantage, and punish scheme. Overall though, despite the balance updates resulting in a net negative for her, the universal changes to the game's physics engine and things like reduced landing lag on aerials would make up the difference, rounding her out to still be a top 10 if not top 15 character. But given how Ultimate has more than 1.5 times the roster size of Smash 4, proportionally, being a top 15 character is equivalent to being a top 10, so for all intents and purposes, ZSS was still thought of as the top tier, and the results were indicative of this. Curiously, she's viewed a lot more favorably in Japan, whose players emphasize methodical, neutral, and punish game plans, as opposed to the West, prioritizing a more best defense is a strong offense win condition. And while Samus has no shortage of aggressive options, the changes to her repertoire don't allow her to get away with as much as she did in Smash 4, a change that would eventually result in her loss of public attention. Even so, early performances were spectacular to say the least. Over in the West, we had Nairo and Vars, namely the latter who won Genesis 7 in dominant fashion. Overall, initial assessments of the character were ambivalent. Many of her previously exceptional tools were degraded in effectiveness despite being compensated elsewhere, and with Nairo, the best CSS player back in Smash 4, relegating her to a secondary in favor of Palutena, the Western scene thought her similar to Cloud and Bayonetta, previous top tiers that were nerfed into mid-tier or worse. At the same time, her representation and subsequent reputation in Japan were much higher. Throughout the first year and a half of Smash Ultimate's timeline, players like Choco, Kuro, and Mars proved that she was still as much of a threat now as she was before, potentially even more so against what many believed at the start. Her skewed presence in Japan, though, would unfortunately influence the developers' perspectives when issuing balance changes. When it came to a strong punish scheme, there were few, if any, characters who could match her in effectiveness. ZSS is a bit of a weird character in that, on a surface level, she's almost identical to someone like Captain Falcon. Both of them have outstanding ground and air physics and rack of damage via bridge or ladder combos before using their kill setups to find stocks. Each has a somersault kick for an up air and a similar double kick aerial. Yet unlike Falcon, she has a few tools that would lead you to believe she's more akin to Sheik or Joker. Then again, her rushdown capabilities are not quite as extensive as either of them, nor does she have a lot of range pressure in the conventional sense. So what exactly is she? I would argue she's a hybrid of a lot of things. She's one part Mario, one part Falcon, one part Sheik / Joker / Greninja, and maybe some other archetype that I can't really think of off the top of my head. But that's what made her such a strong character, especially in Japan. She was more versatile than most other members of her category. For example, what sets her apart from Falcon is her significantly more varied movement options. Courtesy of her Plasma Whip, she can tether snap to ledge with either side B or Zair, and with Flip Jump, she effectively possesses a third jump that also works as a combo breaker, reposition tool, and many other functions. Someone like Sheik also has flexibility and burst movement options through Bouncing Fish and Vanish, but what Samus has that she doesn't is mid-ranged options. Even though Sheik has the uncontested best frame data in the game, its usefulness is diminished by how small her hitboxes are, making it easy for you to outspace or outtrade with her. Samus's hitboxes are stubby overall, but she does have the option to attack from a distance, and her melee attacks are a bit more generous. Her hitboxes are very similar to Wolf's, where any attacks using her legs have surprisingly large hitboxes, not long enough to be a sword mind you, but like I said, they're relatively generous in coverage. As an example, all of her aerials have very big collision radiuses that extend well beyond where her leg is physically attacking, and any move that makes use of her plasma whip is completely disjointed, like her neutral air, zair, up smash, and side B. It bears repeating that she still can't hold a candle to most sword fighters, but it does give her an advantage against other brawlers. Lastly, unlike Joker, who greatly depends on Arsene for early percent kills, or Sheik, who straight up doesn't have that option, ZSS has destructive kill power in the right circumstances, and while she can't rely on them as freely as she did in Smash 4, they're still there. Flip Jump's Grounded Berry and the paralyzing shot from neutral B or down smash guarantee a free boost kick, strong enough to close out stocks well below 100, and she can also use landing neutral air into Flip Jump's spike hit to kill you even earlier, an element that pressures her opponent into being very mindful of their positioning. Among many other things, ZSS at first glance epitomizes everything a competitor would want in a character, and to top it off, she's fun to play and even more enjoyable to watch. Which begs all the more question, why not that many players use her? What's more perplexing is that the answer isn't as conspicuous as it would be on other why no one plays characters. To start, let's call back to her stature over in the East. As stated before, ZSS has considerably greater representation in Japan, a prominent scene that's been touted for its players having a deep and comprehensive understanding of their characters. Time after time, the West has discovered a thing or two just by watching how Japanese contenders perform whenever they attend Western majors. It should be stressed that Japan has considerably more equity in discussion over who should receive buffs or nerfs. I can't recall the exact details, but I do remember hearing about how Ultimate's developers frequently communicated with top players in Japan when deciding balances, and they also follow Japanese tournaments more closely than Western ones. Consequently, Samus's extremely high standing in Japan has resulted in a few nerfs that may appear innocuous at first until you realize they were all targeting a specific aspect in her gameplay that was already tenuous to begin with. Version 2 gave her forward smash a sour spot, but in fairness, it was always one of the weakest forward smashes in the game. Version 3 made her flip jump travel less horizontally, a noteworthy nerf, but in practice, the usefulness of her down B was virtually unaffected. It wasn't until version 7 and then 11 where the trend became obvious. Version 7, coincidentally, was implemented just after Mars' phenomenal performance at Genesis 7, the point many regard as the peak of ZSS's career. On its own, version 7 would have done nothing to affect her standing. The berry timer on flip jump was one of the longest in the game already, even at mid%. You can rip your controller in half and would still be grounded for a good 2 to 3 seconds. The reduction was noticeable, but it's still a reasonably consistent berry timer at higher percents. It's just at low percent it's not anymore. Version 7 complicated things though. Neutral air's almost non-existent landing lag was extended by 2 frames, while boost kick gained 2 frames of startup. On paper, they don't seem like a whole lot, but when you factor in the context of how they're used, they were critical enough to call her top tier status into question. A huge part of her neutral game is setup based. She can't really engage her opponent head on like other rushdown fighters traditionally would, so the bulk of her neutral game comprises either baiting her opponent into mispositioning or using her longer range attacks for neutral interactions, namely her nair. At a frame 10 startup, it's not a very good out of shield option, but the way it strikes is almost identical to Marcina and Croy's neutral airs, a quick strike in front and then behind. What made this move so good was that prior to version 11, it had only 6 frames of landing lag and dealt 4 frames of hit stun on shield, making it -2. It was arguably the safest landing nair in the game. And with a favorable diagonal knockback angle, it could set up into her forward air, back air, and up air at lower percents, and then at mid% she had a notorious flip jump spike off stage. The extra 2 frames of landing lag not only made it less safe on shield, but it narrowed the time window you have for any follow-up attacks. In terms of absolute value, -4 on shield is still fantastic, and Samus retains all of the same combo potential she had at the start. But a big contributor to why she was still top tier during the early days of Ultimate was that nair spam in conjunction with zair for a very safe yet dangerous neutral game. As to the 2 extra frames on boost kick, it obviously worsened her out of shield game, but also compounded with the previous nerf to flip jump's berry timer, no longer allowing her to get easy down B or down smash into up B setups at lower percents. Why this mattered so much is that those setups were really the only edge Samus had over most of her peers, her safety and threatening mid% pressure. The first official Ultimate tier list gave her rank 26, a far cry from her previous 10 to 15 placement. Not just conceptually either, results from all over the world have been compromised, with many of her best players no longer being able to place as high as they did before. Ultimate's top tiers are only really so by way of a small advantage they have over high tiers, otherwise rank 1 to 15 characters are not that much better than rank 16 to 30 in the grand scheme of things, a testament to how balanced Ultimate's roster is. As an example, the rank 3 character is Joker, who resembles Sheik in overall performance, but what he has that she doesn't is a temporary yet overwhelming power spike through Arsene. With that Arsene-based Joker is pragmatically a worse Sheik according to many. The rank 10 character, even though I heavily disagree with it, is Cloud. What he has that's a Lucina doesn't is the option to force approaches with Blade Beam and Limit Charge. I would argue Lucina's offstage presence cancels out with Cloud's onstage presence, but you get what I mean. The top tiers are all just barely stronger than the high tiers. For ZSS, the thing keeping her barely stronger were the very things that got nerfed, no longer making her stand out in any particular way relative to the competition. Were just that, you could potentially reason that she was still deserving of a top tier spot, but circumstances were actively working against her throughout Ultimate's lifetime, more so than others. ZSS's matchup spread is largely in her favor. She has a winning edge over the majority of the cast, but the characters that beat her just so happen to be very prominent in the meta, either from day one or through retroactive buffs. Three that come to mind are Cloud, Roy, and to a lesser extent Chrom, and Aegis, three very popular characters in the current metagame. Roy and Aegis were a challenge for Samus right from the start, and while Cloud was initially even, the buffs given to him throughout the years has made it very difficult for her to interact with him safely. The disparity was only exacerbated by the aforementioned nerfs to her in version 7 and 11 for two reasons. One, the increased lag on Nair made it less effective both on shield and as a neutral tool, giving the swordies one less thing to worry about. 2. The inconsistency in her early kill setups meant that on average, Samus would have to go through more neutral interactions with her opponent per stock, giving those opponents, in this context being Cloud, Roy, and Aegis, more chances to win neutral and get kills on her, which is especially bad for her when you account for her being almost as squishy as Kirby and Sephiroth. Several other matchups that were once even or winning like Bayonetta and Diddy Kong became increasingly more difficult through buffs given to them in tandem with the nerfs given to Samus. For example, she used to be able to nair spam on Diddy even while he was holding banana, but now that's a lot more risky. Putting it all together, I would say the number one reason hardly anyone plays ZSS anymore is that the combination of the few yet substantial nerfs to her, the inclusion of new DLC fighters, buffs to other characters, and a number of difficult matchups for her being very popular themselves were enough to take all the reasons you would want to play her and cancel them out. Yes, she's still a very strong character and more than has what it takes to perform at high and top level, but the margin for error has been significantly narrowed to a point where it's hard to justify using her in the current metagame when she doesn't particularly excel in anything anymore. She's a hybrid between so many archetypes, but that also makes her a jack of all trades, master of none. Her main saving grace is her still unparalleled mobility, but without the right set of tools to make use of it, the onus is placed on the one piloting her to find those windows of opportunity. Other previous top tiers received a similar treatment of nerfs, but unlike her, they still kept a lot of what made them stand out from the others. Wario's waft setups were made a bit less consistent, but only the brain dead easy ones like late up tilt into full waft. Everything else from falling up air or strong up tilt into waft are still there at the same percents they've always been. Palutena's down throw is not as reliable at higher percents, but her late game win conditions have remained mostly untouched. Ike's neutral air was made less effective, but they compensated elsewhere, and he also still retains the same game plan. The nerfs to ZSS didn't just reduce the consistency of her game plan, it may have removed it altogether. Mind you, she can still go for down B up B or near down B setups like before, but she can't get away with a lot of what she got away with before. What they did to Ike, Wario, and Palu was weaken their offensive pressure, whereas for ZSS, they didn't just weaken her offensive pressure, they weakened her neutral pressure. That's why her loss of representation and performance was more sizable than theirs. It's one thing to have to make a person have to work harder to achieve their win con, it's another to make them have to find another win condition altogether. I find it interesting actually. My opinion of ZSS can be boiled down to she's a good character, I just wish she had a bit more. The funny thing is, she did have that bit more, but it was taken away. The unfortunate part is that it's hard to justify why it got taken away. She wasn't particularly a meta threat, yet she was nerfed even harder than some characters above her. I know why she got nerfed, I just don't know the reason why she had to get nerfed. The sucky part is, she's one of the few characters who performs comfortably well against Steve, even though he's getting banned everywhere. In fact, she might have been the best character at beating Steve prior to her nerfs, but we never got to see that and we never will, so I guess it doesn't matter anymore. What are your thoughts on ZSS? Do you think people overreacted to the nerfs, or is she truly not as good as she used to be? Feel free to share in the comments down below. But that's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribe, it really helps me out. Consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and checking out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.